Elias McGraw had spent most of his 40-odd years wandering the ridges and rivers of the frontier, trading pelts, breaking horses, and sleeping under skies so wide a man could drown in them. He carried the look of a man carved from stone, lean and wiry, with grey threaded through his beard and hands hardened like oak. He wasn't chasing fortune anymore. Those years had worn thin. What he wanted now was a place of his own, somewhere the wind spoke softer, and the days carried purpose beyond survival. The opportunity came in a way that sounded like a joke when first told at the saloon. An old log cabin tucked high against the Rockies, standing half forgotten, offered for the price of $1. Men laughed, slapped their knees, and muttered about curses and bad omens. No one had lived there longer than a season in decades. The ones who tried never stayed. Folks whispered that there was something about that place, something you didn't talk about in daylight. But Elias was not a man to be spooked by whispers. He saw timber in the walls, a roof that would hold snow and a stretch of land that would keep a man fed if he knew how to work it. $1 was nothing. Peace, however, was worth everything. He handed over the coin without ceremony and felt the weight of his decision settle heavier than gold in his palm. Yet, before we step into Elias's journey, I invite you to join this trail with us. Subscribe to the channel now so you don't miss the rest of this tale of grit, survival, and the secrets the West tried to bury. The night he signed the deed, the saloon in Clearwater buzzed with talk. A few of the younger ranch hands nudged each other, daring to bet how long before he'd come crawling back. An older man shook his head slowly. "McGraw don't know what he's walking into," he said. "That cabin's got a past best left alone." Elias caught their glances, but said little. His eyes, the color of storm clouds, stayed steady on the glass of whiskey in front of him. He wasn't one for gossip, and fear spread like wildfire when a man let it. The innkeeper, Clara Henderson, leaned against the counter, watching him with quiet curiosity. She had seen men come and go, drifters carried by the wind, and few ever spoke of wanting roots. "You're buying trouble for $1, she told him gently, her voice carrying both warning and respect. "Trouble don't scare me," Elias replied. His tone wasn't boastful. It was plain fact, shaped by years of hard living. Sheriff Wade Harlow, broad-shouldered and slow to smile, set down his cards at the next table. "A man ought to listen to those who know the ground he's stepping on. Some places don't take kindly to settlers, McGraw. That patch of land has sent better men packing." "Then maybe it's time it found one that stays," Elias answered. There was no defiance in his words, just certainty. A hush settled, and even the old miner in the corner, Silas Boone, let out a dry laugh that rattled like loose gravel. "You'll see soon enough," Silas muttered, sipping his whiskey. "That cabin's got a secret locked tighter than a bank vault. Men went looking for it and none came out the same." The fire crackled, lamps smoked, and the talk shifted to cattle prices and the coming winter. But in the spaces between laughter and cards, eyes turned back to Elias. He knew what they thought, that he was either a fool or too stubborn for his own good. Yet deep inside, the challenge stirred something that had lain quiet for years. Whatever the cabin held, he meant to face it. When dawn came, he saddled his horse, tied his meager possessions, and turned north. The trail stretched into country where the peaks wore snow even in summer, and pine forests swallowed the horizon. The $1 he had spent was behind him. The truth ahead waited silent, patient as stone. And though Elias rode steady, he could not shake the echo of Silas Boone's warning. The trail to the cabin wound upward through pine-choked ridges where the wind carried the sharp scent of resin and snow. Elias guided his mare along a rocky pass, her hooves striking sparks against stone, while the distant peaks gleamed white under the morning sun. Every mile farther from Clearwater left behind the murmur of men's doubts and carried him deeper into silence. Silence was something Elias had long made his companion, but this silence felt heavier, as though the mountains themselves were holding their breath. By midday he reached a clearing where the trees broke wide enough to reveal it, the cabin. Built of thick logs darkened by weather and years, it stood square against the slope, sturdy though forgotten. The roof sagged slightly under the weight of neglect, moss crawling between shingles, yet the bones of the place looked strong. A stone chimney rose like a sentinel, and the front door hung crooked but intact. Elias dismounted and stood still, listening. The air here carried no bird call, not even the chatter of squirrels stirred the branches. It was as if the forest skirted the clearing with wary steps, leaving the cabin to its own company. He loosened the saddle straps, letting his mare drink from a trickling stream nearby. When he laid his hand on the cabin's wall, the logs were cool and rough beneath his palm, as if storing the memory of winters long past. "Looks like you've been waiting," he muttered to himself, pushing the door open with a slow shove. Hinges groaned, and dust swirled in shafts of light cutting through gaps in the boards. Inside, the air smelled of old smoke and earth. A stone hearth sat against the far wall, blackened from fires burned long ago. The floorboards creaked under his weight, but they held. Against one wall stood the remnants of a cot, frame splintered, bedding long rotted away. Someone had carved initials into the wood above the mantel, their letters faint but deliberate. J.C. Elias traced them with a finger, wondering what hand had left them behind. Though the place was worn, it was not broken. He could see himself splitting wood out front, mending the roof, setting traps in the nearby streams. Solitude was no stranger to him, and this cabin promised a kind of quiet permanence he hadn't known since boyhood. Still, there was something unsettled here, an absence that weighed heavier than presence. As dusk fell, Elias built a small fire in the hearth. Flames licked upward, throwing shadows that danced against the walls. The light warmed the space, but it did little to ease the feeling that eyes watched from the corners. He told himself it was years of disuse making the place feel hollow. Still, as the wind rattled loose shingles above, he caught himself glancing toward the dark edges of the cabin where the firelight failed to reach. Later, sitting on the rough-hewn step, Elias whittled at a piece of pine, listening to the woods. The mare cropped grass quietly, her ears twitching at every snap of a branch. No owl hooted, no fox barked. The hush was unnatural, and it pressed against his chest until he let out a slow breath. "A man makes his own home," he said aloud, as though answering some unspoken question. Yet in that moment, Elias knew this cabin carried a story not written in its timber or stone. The weight of other lives lingered here, silent but unyielding, and he could not shake the thought that stepping across its threshold meant stepping into their unfinished tale. Night settled hard, stars cutting cold through the sky. Elias lay wrapped in his bedroll on the floorboards, fire smouldering low. Sleep came fitful, broken by the groan of timbers shifting as though stirred by memory. He told himself the place was only settling after years of neglect. But deep in his chest, something whispered that the cabin had not welcomed him. It was only waiting. Morning broke with a pale light spilling through the cracks in the cabin's walls. Elias rose stiff from the floorboards, the fire long since burned to ash. The air bit cold, sharper than he remembered from the low valleys, and he pulled his coat tight as he stepped outside. Frost glazed the grass, crunching under his boots, while the peaks above glowed pink in the rising sun. This was the beginning of his claim, a place to carve out a life not shaped by anyone else's hand. His first task was the roof. He hauled stones to weigh the shingles, patched gaps with pine boughs, and drove nails with steady rhythm. Each strike echoed across the clearing, a reminder that the cabin breathed again under his care. When sweat dampened his collar despite the chill, he paused, gazing at the forest that hemmed him in on all sides. It stood solemn, branches heavy with silence as though measuring him. By midday, Elias had split enough wood to last through the night. He stacked it against the wall, each log fitting neatly, the sight of order giving him quiet satisfaction. Then he set his traps down by the creek, fingers moving with practiced ease. Years of mountain living had taught him where mink trails crossed, and how the current carried scent. Kneeling at the bank, he caught his reflection in the water. Lined face, hard eyes, hair gone more silver than black. This cabin might just outlast him, and that thought brought an odd comfort. Inside he set to sweeping, stirring years of dust into the air until sunlight caught it in swirls. Beneath the grime, the floor was strong, hand-hewn planks laid with care. He found a broken chair tucked in the corner and mended it with scraps of wood. When he finally sat, it creaked but held his weight. He leaned back, letting the fire he'd built crackle steady, the smell of smoke mixing with the scent of pine sap clinging to his hands, yet not all he uncovered brought ease. While scrubbing soot from the hearth, Elias noticed faint markings etched into the stones, symbols or letters dulled by time. They weren't random scratches. They had purpose, though their meaning escaped him. He traced them with his thumb, unsettled by their presence. Later, searching the shelves, he discovered a tin mug dented at the rim, a rusted lantern, and an old pipe stem left behind. These relics felt like whispers from men who had come before, men who had vanished without farewell. That night, after setting snares near the tree line, Elias cooked rabbit stew, the rich smell filling the cabin. He ate slow, savoring the warmth. The quiet pressed in heavy, the only sounds the crack of fire and the restless wind scraping the roof. Solitude was something he understood, but here it came tinged with unease. He kept glancing at the carved initials above the mantel J.C., wondering if that man had once sat exactly where he now sat, staring into flames with the same restless thoughts. As hours dragged, Elias sharpened his knife, the rasp of steel against stone steady in the stillness. A branch snapped outside, sharp as a rifle shot. He froze, listening. His mare shifted in the clearing but gave no alarm. Still, the forest seemed to pull tighter around him, its silence unnatural. Elias set his knife aside and stood, peering into the dark beyond the door. Nothing moved. He told himself the woods always tested a new settler. They probed for weakness, for fear, and only those who endured earned a place. Yet even as he closed the door and latched it, he could not ignore the weight of those carved letters and the sense that the cabin was more than timber and stone. It held stories buried deep, and sooner or later they would demand to be heard. A week passed before Elias rode into Clearwater again, his mare laden with furs and a list of supplies he couldn't gather from the mountain alone. The town bustled under a sharp autumn wind, dust swirling along the main street, wagons rattling, and dogs chasing one another through the alleys. To most men, Clearwater was just another frontier town, half wild and hungry for growth. To Elias, it was where he measured how outsiders looked at him, whether they saw a neighbor or a fool destined to fail. He tied his mare outside Henderson's Inn and stepped through the swinging doors. Inside, warmth from the stove wrapped around him, carrying the smell of fresh bread and boiled coffee. Clara Henderson glanced up from behind the counter, her auburn hair pulled into a bun, sleeves rolled to her elbows. She studied Elias with the sharp eyes of a woman who had seen men arrive full of fire and leave broken by the land. "You're still standing," she said, wiping her hands on a rag. "I'll admit I half expected you back sooner." Elias set his hat on the counter. "Cabin's holding. Needed flour, salt, nails. Figure I'll take some tobacco too." Clara measured out the goods, her brow furrowed. "Folks don't stay up there, McGraw. Something about that place drives men out quicker than hunger. You'd be wise to listen." "I didn't ride up there to be wise," Elias replied with a faint smile. "Just to live quiet." The saloon across the street erupted in laughter. Elias turned as Sheriff Wade Harlow pushed through the doors and crossed over, his boots striking the wooden planks with measured weight. Harlow was a man who filled space without trying, broad shoulders, iron-grey mustache, and eyes that carried judgment like a badge. "McGraw," he greeted, tipping his hat just enough to acknowledge him. "Heard you're fixing that old place." "Mighty stubborn of you." Elias met his gaze evenly. "Stubborn's what keeps a roof standing, Sheriff." Harlow's mouth twitched, not quite a smile. "Or what gets a man buried under it. Folks remember things about that cabin. Bad things." Before Elias could answer, a rasping laugh rose from the corner. Silas Boone, a wiry old miner with a beard yellowed by whiskey, leaned forward over his glass. His voice cracked like dry timber. "Bad things, sure enough. Cabin don't take to company. Men go in, come out hollow-eyed, or don't come out at all." The inn fell quiet. Even the card game paused as men tilted their ears toward the conversation. Elias straightened, his voice steady. "Men see ghosts where there ain't any. What I see is a home." Silas jabbed a bony finger at him. "You think you're tougher than the rest? You ain't. That cabin's got secrets older than you or me, McGraw, mark my words." Clara's hand rested on the counter, her knuckles white. Let the man be, Silas. He's earned his peace same as anyone. Elias gathered his supplies, tucking them into his saddlebags. The stares followed him as he stepped outside, a mix of pity, curiosity, and quiet fear. He could feel it pressing down like the mountain snow he knew would come soon enough. Sheriff Harlow joined him on the boardwalk, voice low. "You're not a fool, McGraw. You know this land's got teeth. If that cabin chews you up, don't say I didn't warn you." Elias settled his hat back on his head, looking north toward the ridges. "Sheriff, I've been chewed up by worse. But this time I aim to stay standing." With that he mounted his mare and rode out, the town shrinking behind him. Yet even as the mountains rose again to meet him, Elias carried the weight of their words, and in the quiet of his own heart, he wondered how long resolve alone could hold against whatever truth lay waiting in the cabin's shadows. Days grew shorter, the sun falling behind the peaks before Elias was ready to lay down his tools. Each evening, when the fire burned low and shadows stretched across the cabin walls, he found his eyes drawn to the same spot, the uneven section of floor near the hearth. At first he thought it was warping, wood gone soft with years, but the more he studied it, the more he noticed iron glinting faint beneath the dust. One morning, with the chill still heavy in the air, Elias cleared the hearthstones and pried up the loose boards. His knife scraped against metal, and there it was, a trapdoor reinforced with rusted bands, a padlock securing it shut. The iron was thick, black with age, and the hasp bent under his probing. He knelt there, breath steady, palm resting on the cold surface. The lock had not been touched in years, maybe decades, but it still held fast. A shiver crawled up his spine, though the air in the cabin was warm from the fire. The memory of Silas Boone's words returned unbidden. "Men go in, don't come out the same." Elias tightened his jaw. He wasn't one to scare from shadows, yet his gut whispered caution. That afternoon he rode down to Clearwater for oil, nails, and a fresh whetstone. Word of the discovery must have traveled faster than he imagined, because the moment he stepped into the general store, a young ranch hand leaned against the counter and smirked. "Heard you found the lock," the boy drawled. "Smart money says you leave it shut." Elias ignored him, gathering what he needed, but Clara appeared from the kitchen doorway, her expression serious. "It's true, then? You found something under the floor?" Elias set the can of oil on the counter. "A door, nothing more." "Doors lead somewhere," Clara replied softly. "Sometimes to places best forgotten." Before he could answer, Sheriff Harlow entered, spurs clicking against the wood. He studied Elias with that same measuring stare he always carried. "You'd do better patching your roof than prying open old locks. That cabin stood empty because no man wanted what was buried with it." Elias met his gaze without flinching. "You believe in curses, Sheriff?" "I believe in history," Harlow said flatly, "and history's got long claws." Even Silas Boone, half asleep at a corner table, lifted his head and rasped, "You open what ain't meant to be opened. You'll regret it. That trapdoor's the reason no one stays." "You think you're different, McGraw, but the mountain takes its toll." Elias gathered his supplies, voice steady though the weight of their stares pressed hard. "A lock's just a lock. Iron don't frighten me." But when he rode back to the cabin, the words lingered like burrs clinging to his coat. The forest greeted him with the same uneasy silence, branches stiff against the sky. Inside, the trapdoor waited, squat and patient, the lock gleaming dull in the firelight. He circled it as though it were some beast lying in ambush, every creak of the boards beneath his boots loud in his ears. That night he lay awake on his bedroll, staring at the rafters. Each gust of wind seemed to rattle the lock below, though he knew it was imagination. His mind turned restless. What had they hidden down there? Why lock it away so carefully, then abandon the place altogether? Curiosity tugged at him like a current, yet caution held him still. As dawn bled through the shutters, Elias sat up, weary but resolved. The cabin had given him shelter, warmth, and work enough to fill his hands, but it had also given him a challenge he could not ignore. He knew the trapdoor would not leave his thoughts, no matter how much he tried to busy himself with woodcutting or hunting. Sooner or later, he would have to choose, heed the warnings that clung to every word in town, or face the unknown beneath his feet. The first snow came sudden, a grey curtain sweeping down from the ridges before Elias had time to set all his traps or finish sealing the roof. By morning the cabin sat buried in white, smoke from the chimney curling against a sky heavy with moor. The air cut sharp as a knife, stinging his lungs with every breath. Winter had closed its grip, and the mountains showed no mercy. Elias spent long hours chopping wood, each strike echoing through the frozen clearing, his mare huddled beneath a makeshift lean-to, breath steaming in clouds. The silence deepened with the cold. No birds called, no creek trickled. Even the trees seemed muted, branches bowed under snow. Inside, the cabin grew dim and tight, the fire his only companion. As days shortened, supplies dwindled quicker than he liked. Flour ran thin, and the snares he set near the tree line came back empty more often than not. Elias rationed what he had, chewing tough strips of jerky slow to make them last. Hunger gnawed at him, but not as sharply as the solitude, and always, beneath his feet, the trapdoor waited. Each night when the wind howled, rattling the shutters and whistling through cracks, Elias swore he heard faint sounds below. At first he dismissed it as the wood shrinking in the cold. But some nights, when the fire burned low and the cabin held only silence, a creak rose from the boards, as if something shifted in the dark cellar beneath. One evening, with the snow piling waist-high outside, Elias sat sharpening his knife. The rasp of steel against stone filled the room until it was broken by a hollow thud beneath him. He froze, the knife still in his hand. The sound came again, subtle like weight settling on old timbers. He leaned forward, staring at the trapdoor, its rusted lock catching the firelight. His chest tightened, not from fear exactly, but from the question that stalked him unrelenting. What lies beneath? He rose, pacing the small room, boots thumping against the boards. The thought of prying open that door clawed at him, yet the warnings from town echoed just as loud. Silas's rasp, Clara's worry, Harlow's measured threat, they tangled with his own hunger for truth. The storm raged for 3 days straight. Snow drifted against the cabin walls until the windows disappeared, and the only light came from the fire. Elias dozed in fits, waking to the creak of the roof or the groan of timbers. Each time his eyes found the trapdoor, black iron glistening in the glow. He felt like a man sharing quarters with a stranger he could neither see nor dismiss. On the 4th day, the storm broke, leaving the world outside glittering white, silent as a shroud. Elias pushed open the door to clear snow, breath billowing in the brittle air. His arms ached from chopping, his stomach hollow from thin meals, but he kept moving, knowing stillness could kill faster than cold. When he stepped back inside, stamping snow from his boots, he caught the faintest whiff, metallic, sharp, unlike wood smoke. He paused, nose twitching, eyes narrowing toward the trapdoor. The scent vanished as quick as it came, leaving him uncertain whether it had been real or a trick of his imagination. That night, he sat by the fire, staring long into the flames. The lock gleamed faintly, almost mocking him. He tightened his fists, whispering to himself, "It's just iron and wood." Yet even as the words left his mouth, he knew the truth. The cabin's secret would not rest. It pressed at him with every gust of wind, every groan of timber, every restless hour of cold. The snow outside sealed him in, but it wasn't the storm he feared. It was the silence beneath his feet, waiting. The storm broke, but winter still held the land in a grip of iron. Elias rode down to Clearwater for supplies, frost clinging to his beard, his mare's breath rising in plumes. The town looked smaller under the weight of snow, roofs bowed, streets half buried, yet its people bustled, trading, bartering, surviving as they always had. Elias dismounted stiffly, each step heavy after weeks alone with the cabin and its silence. Clara Henderson met him at the inn, her apron dusted with flour, cheeks flushed from the stove's heat. Her eyes softened when she saw him, but worry shadowed her face. "You shouldn't stay up there alone through storms like these," she said, pressing a steaming mug into his hands. "The mountains swallow men whole when the cold sets in." Elias sipped, the bitter coffee warming his chest. "I've weathered worse. Cabin keeps the snow off my head. That's enough." Clara's voice dropped, almost pleading. "It's not just the cold. Folks talk, Elias. They say you've stirred something in that place. You look thinner, tired. Promise me you'll be careful." He set the mug down gently, meeting her gaze. "I don't spook easy, Clara. A man's got to face what's put before him." Her lips pressed tight, but she said no more, only returned to her work with a glance that lingered too long. Later, as Elias loaded his saddlebags at the store, Sheriff Harlow appeared, his coat dusted with snow, expression as steady as always. "McGraw," he said, voice low, "I'll put it plain. I don't like what you're doing up there." Elias cinched the leather straps, not looking up. "What I do on my land's my own affair." Harlow's jaw tightened. "A man's choices don't happen in a vacuum. Trouble has a way of spilling downhill, and this town's at the bottom. You'd be wise to quit before it spreads." Elias turned then, his eyes cold as the peaks behind him. "Sheriff, I've buried too many winters to back down now. If the cabin holds trouble, I'll meet it myself." The two men stared, silence taut between them, before Harlow finally stepped back, brushing snow from his hat. "Don't say you weren't warned." That night, Elias stopped at the saloon for a hot meal before riding out. Silas Boone sat hunched in his usual corner, whiskey glass trembling in his hand. His eyes followed Elias, sharp despite the drink. When Elias passed, Silas leaned forward, his voice a cracked whisper. "It ain't the cold that'll break you, McGraw. It's what's locked down there." Elias paused, his back stiff. "And what do you know of it, Silas?" The old miner's gaze turned glassy, haunted. "Enough to keep me drunk most nights. I knew men who went digging where they shouldn't. Came back with eyes hollow like the mountain took something from 'em. You open that lock, you won't be the same." Elias studied him, searching for truth in the slur. "You ever see it yourself?" Silas shook his head, lips curling bitter. "Didn't need to. Some doors you don't need to open to know what waits." He tipped his glass, spilling whiskey down his beard. "But you ain't the type to listen, are you?" Elias left without answering, the words clinging tighter than he liked. Outside, snowflakes drifted under lantern light, and the cold felt heavier than when he'd arrived. He rode back into the mountains, Clara's worry, Harlow's warning, and Silas's broken laughter trailing him like ghosts. The cabin greeted him with silence, the trapdoor waiting as it always did, patient and unyielding. And though Elias tried to push their voices from his mind, he knew each had carved a mark on his resolve. He had chosen his path, but the weight of their doubt pressed like the snow piling on the roof. The cabin had grown colder, though the fire burned steady. Elias sat long into the night staring at the trapdoor, the rusted lock gleaming faintly in the shifting glow. Clara's warning, Harlow's threat, Silas's bitter laughter, all of it circled his thoughts like wolves around a campfire. He had tried to work, to focus on wood, on snares, on keeping hunger at bay, but his mind returned again and again to the iron bands holding back the unknown. At last he could endure no more. Elias fetched his tools, laying them beside him on the floor. He poured lamp oil over the lock, letting it seep into the cracks, and worked it with a file until sparks leapt. His breath came slow, deliberate, the sound of metal grating against metal loud in the stillness. The lock fought, stubborn as a mule, but Elias's will was steadier. After hours of labor, with a final wrench of his crowbar, the shackle snapped. The echo rang through the cabin like a shot. Elias froze, heart pounding, listening. Only the fire crackled, only the wind whispered against the shutters. He lifted the broken lock, heavy in his hand, then set it aside. The trapdoor lay free at last, its surface scarred with age, its hinges black with rust. He gripped the iron ring and pulled. At first the door refused, swollen tight against the frame. He braced his boots, heaved again, and the boards groaned, dust swirling upward in choking clouds. Slowly the hatch lifted, revealing a black mouth yawning beneath. A rush of stale air spilled out, cold and metallic, carrying the scent of stone long buried. Lantern in hand, Elias leaned over the opening. The light barely reached the bottom, revealing a narrow staircase cut from rough timber, steps vanishing into shadow. The cellar stretched deeper than he expected, swallowed in darkness that felt more solid than the earth itself. His pulse thudded in his ears. For a long moment he simply stood there, lantern trembling in his grip, caught between caution and the pull of curiosity. Every instinct screamed to leave it shut, to nail the boards down and forget what lay beneath. But another voice, quieter yet stronger, whispered that turning back would leave him haunted forever. He descended the first step, then another. The wood creaked under his weight, each groan echoing into the depths. The air grew colder with every breath, damp against his skin, carrying the faint tang of rust and something older, something he could not name. At the bottom, his lantern's glow revealed stone walls, slick with moisture, roots creeping through cracks like skeletal fingers. Broken shelves leaned against the walls, cluttered with tools eaten by rust. A shattered barrel lay in the corner, its staves scattered. But it was not the decay that held Elias's eyes. It was the faint glimmer of metal on a table pressed against the far wall. He approached, lantern raised high, and found a scatter of objects. A dented tin plate, a cracked glass bottle, and beside them a leather-bound book thick with dust. He brushed the cover clean, the name faintly etched in the surface, Jedediah Coulter. Elias's fingers tightened around the journal. He had heard the name in Clearwater once, muttered in passing. A settler who vanished generations ago, his land swallowed by disputes and silence. The discovery stirred a chill deeper than the cold of the cellar. He turned slowly, lantern light sweeping the space. Shadows leapt across the walls, roots twisting like coiled serpents. Though he was alone, Elias felt the weight of another presence lingering in the dark, watching from corners just beyond the reach of light. The journal pressed against his chest as he climbed back up, each step heavier than the last. When he pushed the trapdoor shut, the fire's glow felt too bright, the cabin too small. The broken lock lay on the floor like a warning, and Elias knew with grim certainty he had crossed a line. The journal sat heavy in Elias's hands, its cracked leather cover dry as bark, the letters of Jedediah Coulter nearly worn smooth. He set it on the table by the fire, lantern light flickering across the pages as he eased it open. Dust rose in a soft cloud, carrying the scent of mold and time. The ink had faded, but the handwriting remained firm, the strokes bold as if the man had pressed his will into every word. The first entries spoke of labor, felling trees, planting corn, hunting elk in the high valleys. Jedediah's voice was plain, practical, the kind of words a settler scratched down at the end of a long day. But as Elias turned the pages, the tone shifted. He read of quarrels with neighboring cattlemen, of fences cut in the night, of threats whispered over whiskey. "They mean to drive me off this land," one passage declared, the script slanting harder, angrier, "but I will not yield." Elias leaned closer, his eyes narrowing as the story unfolded. Jedediah wrote of his wife, Sarah, and their two sons, Daniel and James. The family had come west chasing freedom, but the land proved harsher than dreams allowed. One winter, Sarah fell ill, and though Jedediah rode for a doctor, snow blocked the passes. She died before spring thawed, leaving him to raise the boys alone. The grief bled through every line, grief that hardened into defiance. The later entries grew darker still. Jedediah spoke of men riding under moonlight, shots fired in the distance, cattle driven off cliffs. He described deals struck in secret, land deeds traded like poker chips, and a rancher named Horace Talbot who seemed to pull the strings. "Talbot's greed will bury this valley," Jedediah scrawled. "If I fall, my words must outlast me. The truth will not stay buried." Elias sat back, the fire popping as if in answer. His rough hands turned another page where the writing grew jagged, hurried. Jedediah described hiding documents, maps, deeds, records of Talbot's corruption, somewhere within the cabin. He wrote of locking the cellar, of vowing that if he could not stop the ranchers in life, he would leave behind the means for others to do so. The final pages trailed off into broken sentences. Mentions of footsteps outside at night, of voices calling his name, of his boys gone missing for days. The ink smudged in places as though his hand had trembled. The last entry read simply, "If this book is found, remember my fight. Do not let them erase us." Elias closed the journal slowly, his jaw tight. The room seemed smaller, the shadows closer. He pictured Jedediah sitting at the same hearth, scratching out those words while the storm of his life raged beyond the cabin walls. The initials carved above the mantel, J.C., suddenly felt like more than a mark of pride. They were a gravestone etched in timber. He set the journal aside, staring at the trapdoor now shut tight beneath his feet. Somewhere down there, hidden deeper still, lay what Jedediah had guarded, proof of men's greed, records that could change the balance of land and power in the valley. But if those words in the journal were true, others had already killed for it. Elias rubbed his temples, fatigue pressing hard. He thought of Clara's eyes, kind yet shadowed with fear, of Harlow's stern warning, of Silas Boone's drunken mutterings. Each of them had known pieces of this story, though none had spoken it plain. Now Elias carried the whole of it, and it weighed heavier than the snow on the roof. The fire hissed as sap burst in the logs. Elias leaned forward, elbows on his knees, whispering into the flames. "What did you leave me, Jedediah? And why does it still hold sway after all these years?" The cabin gave no answer. Only the silence pressed in, thick and waiting. Word traveled fast in Clearwater. Elias had not spoken of the journal, nor of what he suspected lay deeper in the cellar, but rumors bloomed all the same. Men at the saloon whispered of hidden treasure, of outlaw gold, of secrets worth more than land itself. By the time Elias rode into town for flour and lamp oil, the air was thick with stares that clung to him like burrs. As he tied his mare outside the store, two ranch hands leaned against the rail, their coats stiff with dust and their eyes sharp with greed. One spat in the dirt and grinned. "McGraw," he drawled. "Word is you've been digging where you shouldn't. Found yourself something shiny up in that shack." Elias brushed past without a word, but the second man stepped in front of him, blocking the door. "We ain't asking polite. Men say there's gold stashed in your floorboards. Maybe you ought to share with the ones who work this valley." Elias's voice came low, steady. "Step aside." The man's grin faltered under the weight of those storm-grey eyes. After a tense beat, he moved, muttering under his breath. Elias entered, collected his supplies and left without lingering, but he felt their eyes burning into his back as he rode north again. That evening, Clara appeared at the cabin, bundled against the cold, cheeks flushed from the ride. Elias helped her down, surprised. She rarely ventured this far into the mountains. "What brings you here?" he asked. Her voice carried urgency. "You've stirred them up? The talk in town's grown ugly. Men think you found something worth killing over." Elias frowned, guiding her inside. "Let them talk. I've nothing but timber and stone." Clara's eyes searched his, as if testing his words. "I don't believe that, and neither do they. If you're hiding something, Elias, you'd best be careful who you trust." Before he could answer, hoofbeats echoed through the clearing. Elias stiffened, hand brushing the hilt of his knife. 3 riders approached, shadows stretched long in the dusk. The same ranch hands from town, joined by another, dismounted with slow purpose. The first called out, voice sharp, "Evening, McGraw. We figured we'd come see this miracle cabin of yours. Maybe take a look at what's got you hiding in the hills." Elias stepped onto the porch, Clara behind him. "There's nothing here for you," he said plainly. The second man smirked. "We'll be the judge of that." He took a step forward, but Elias's hand rested easy on his rifle, and the motion stopped him cold. Tension crackled in the freezing air. One wrong move and blood would stain the snow. The leader spat, eyes narrowing. "You can't hold out forever. Men like you, loners, always break. We'll be back." They mounted up and rode off, their laughter echoing down the trail like wolves calling in the dark. Clara let out a shaky breath, clutching her shawl. "They won't let this go." Elias closed the door, jaw set. "Let them come." "I didn't ride all this way to bend to another man's greed." Clara studied him, her voice soft but edged with fear. "Stubbornness cuts both ways, Elias. Just promise me you'll live through whatever's coming." Her words lingered after she left, swallowed by the night. Elias sat by the fire, the journal on the table before him, the broken lock at his feet. Outside, the forest lay still under a blanket of snow, but he knew the storm was no longer just in the weather. It was in the hearts of men circling like coyotes, hungry for what they believed lay beneath his cabin. The days that followed turned grim. Elias found snares cut clean, the cords sliced with sharp steel. Tracks in the snow told the story plain. Boot prints circling his traps, men moving where no one had business to be. The pelts he had stretched to dry were gone one morning, stripped from the racks as though wolves had learned to walk upright. Elias said nothing to the empty air, but his jaw tightened until his teeth ached. The ranch hands had carried their threats into action. They meant to wear him down, strip him of food and will until he abandoned the cabin like the others before him. His mare grew restless, ears flicking at every sound from the timberline. Elias stroked her neck, murmuring low, but he felt the same unease humming in his bones. The forest no longer offered quiet solitude. It bristled with menace, a hunting ground where the hunter was now prey. Clara came again, braving the snow with a basket of bread and dried meat. She pressed it into Elias's hands, her eyes fierce. "You're starving yourself for pride," she said. He shook his head. "Not pride. Resolve. If I leave now, they've won before the fight's begun." Her voice softened, trembled even. "Then at least let someone stand with you. You don't have to carry it alone." Elias looked at her, the firelight catching the determination in her eyes. He wanted to say yes, to let her stay, but the words stuck. "You've a place here in town, Clara. A life. I won't drag you into my storm." She touched his arm, a fleeting warmth. "Storms don't ask permission who they strike, Elias. Be careful." After she left, the cabin felt colder. Elias kept to his work, patching holes, sharpening tools, rationing every bite of food. Nights stretched long, filled with creaks and whispers from the cellar below. The journal remained on the table, its presence heavy, as if Jedediah Coulter himself still watched over his unfinished fight. One morning, Elias followed the trail of his sabotaged traps and found hoofprints mingled with the boot tracks. They led toward the ridge, where smoke curled faint against the sky. Men were camped close, closer than he'd realized. His fists clenched at the thought of them watching, waiting, circling his life like vultures. That night, as the fire smoldered, Elias sat sharpening his knife again, the rhythm steady. He thought of Harlow's warning, of Clara's fear, of Silas's haunted ramblings. He thought of Jedediah, too, scribbling words with the weight of loss pressing his hand. Speaking to the empty room, Elias muttered, "You try to stand your ground, Jedediah." "I reckon I'll do the same." The cabin groaned under the weight of wind and snow. Hunger gnawed, sleep came fitful, but Elias's will held fast. He was no stranger to lean winters, no stranger to men who believed they could take what was not theirs. What pressed hardest was not the cold or the hunger, but the waiting, the certainty that the ranch hands would return, and soon. He kept his rifle loaded, tools close and his back to the fire where shadows could not surprise him. The trapdoor lay sealed at his feet, but its presence throbbed like a second heartbeat in the room. He had uncovered Jedediah's story, and now he bore the burden of finishing it. As dawn crept pale across the peaks, Elias stood at the door, staring at the endless white. His breath clouded in the air, his hand resting on the frame. The mountain tested every man in its own way. For Elias, the test had come not with blizzard or hunger alone, but with men who would bleed him dry to bury the truth he had found. The struggle was no longer just survival of the body. It was survival of purpose. Snow still clung heavy to the eaves when Elias decided he could wait no longer. The ranch hands circled him, cutting off food, poisoning the quiet with fear. He needed more than firewood and resolve to stand against them. Jedediah's journal had hinted at hidden proof, records of corruption, deeds that could tilt the valley's balance. If such things were buried, they would be in the cellar. Elias lit his lantern and unbarred the trap-door. The air that rose to meet him was colder than before, damp with the musk of earth and rot. His boots creaked against the steps as he descended, light swaying against stone walls. He had been down here once already, but this time he searched deeper, running calloused hands along the cracks and shelves. In a corner where roots had broken through, he noticed fresh disturbance. Soil piled unevenly, as if once shoveled, then forgotten. He set down the lantern, drew his knife, and began to dig with careful strokes. The earth came loose, dry in some patches, wet in others, until steel struck wood with a hollow thump. Elias froze, heart pounding, then cleared the dirt away. A chest lay half buried, its surface wrapped in rotting oilcloth. The wood, though worn, still held together under his grip. He dragged it free and brushed it clean, fingers trembling. The lock had rusted away long ago, crumbling beneath the edge of his blade. Slowly he lifted the lid. Inside lay no glitter of gold, no stacks of silver. Instead, bundles of parchment filled the chest, tied with string. Land deeds, maps, letters, and contracts, each stamped or signed with names Elias recognized from whispers in town. Horace Talbot, foremost among them. He pulled one free, holding it up to the lantern. The ink had faded but remained legible, a deed transferring grazing rights from a small settler to Talbot, the signature shaky, the terms predatory. Another letter, folded neat, spoke of payments made to the sheriff of a neighboring county, bribes to drive families from their claims. Elias sifted through them, breath sharp, realization dawning. This was no treasure chest of riches. It was a ledger of sins, a weapon of truth. Jedediah Coulter had not been hiding wealth, he had been preserving proof, a record that showed how men like Talbot had choked the valley into submission. At the bottom, beneath the stacks, Elias found one final bundle wrapped tighter than the rest. He opened it with care. Inside was a letter written in Jedediah's own hand, the script familiar now after nights of reading. To the one who finds this, know that I fought but could not win. These papers are the strength I could not wield. Guard them, for the valley's soul rests in their keeping. Elias closed the chest, his throat tight. He imagined Jedediah lowering it into the earth, alone and desperate, praying that someday another man would take up the burden. Now, decades later, that burden sat in Elias's hands. When he climbed back into the cabin, lantern flickering, the fire's glow felt strange, as if the room itself waited for his choice. The papers lay stacked on the table, fragile yet heavy with consequence. He could almost hear Clara's voice urging caution, Harlow's warning about history's claws, Silas's drunken mutters about men who didn't come out the same. But as Elias stared at the documents, a grim resolve settled over him. The ranch hands had guessed at gold, yet what he held was worth far more. It was power, dangerous enough to draw blood. He could not return it to the earth, not now. The mountain outside lay quiet under snow, but Elias knew the storm was just beginning. The chest remained on Elias's table for 2 nights, its papers spread and studied by firelight. Each page deepened his certainty. Jedediah Coulter had preserved more than memories. He had preserved the truth. But truth was a blade that cut both ways, and others were already sniffing at its edge. The ranch hands returned before dawn on the 3rd day. Elias woke to hoofbeats pounding through the clearing, the snort of horses in the brittle air. He rose without hurry, already dressed, rifle close. Through the shutter he counted 5 riders, not 3 this time. They dismounted with confidence, boots crunching snow, rifles slung careless but ready. Their leader, the same man who had grinned at him in town, called out, "McGraw, we know what you got. Hand it over and maybe we'll let you walk out of here alive." Elias stepped onto the porch, rifle cradled easy in his arms. "All I've got is firewood and a roof. You came a long way to steal what ain't yours," the man sneered. "Don't play dumb. Talbot's name's on the papers, clear as day. Word spread. You think you can hold on to that alone? You're one man against a valley full of riders." Elias's voice stayed calm. "One man's enough to stand where others run." The standoff hung in the air, cold and sharp. Then from the tree line came a crack, another rifle, not Elias's. One of the ranch hands yelped, dropping to his knees, hat spinning into the snow. The others spun, shouting. From the trees stepped Silas Boone, eyes blazing clear despite the whiskey that usually dulled them. His old rifle shook in his hands, but his voice carried iron. "Leave him be," Silas rasped. "You want those papers? You'll walk over my body first." The ranch hands cursed, aiming their rifles. Just then another figure rode into the clearing, Clara Henderson, hair loose under her hood, pistol steady in her grip. She dismounted quick, eyes burning. "This valley's had enough of your kind," she shouted. "You'll not bleed it any further." For a moment the attackers faltered, surprised by the sudden show of defiance. But greed is a strong spur. Their leader spat, raising his rifle. "Then you'll fall with him." The fight broke in a flurry of sound. Elias dropped behind the porch rail, firing clean and steady, wood splintering under return shots. Silas's rifle boomed again from the trees, forcing the men to scatter. Clara moved like she'd trained her whole life, pistol barking as she ducked behind Elias's stack of firewood. Snow churned under boots, smoke stung the air, and the sharp crack of gunfire echoed off the peaks. Elias felt the old instincts return. Measured breaths, steady aim, patience forged in wilderness years. He wasn't fighting for pelts or pride now. He was fighting for the truth Jedediah Coulter had entrusted to him. The ranch hands pressed hard, but the cabin's walls shielded Elias, and the defenders' resolve did not break. One man fell clutching his leg, another dropped his rifle and fled toward the horses. The leader cursed, firing wildly, until a shot from Silas tore the brim from his hat and drove him scrambling behind a stump. At last, the remaining men dragged their wounded comrade and mounted in retreat, spurring their horses down the trail with curses flung over their shoulders. The clearing fell silent, but for the hiss of smoke and the ragged breaths of those left standing. Elias lowered his rifle, shoulders heaving, eyes scanning the tree line until he was sure they were gone. Clara stepped from cover, cheeks flushed, hands trembling though she kept her chin high. Silas leaned on his rifle, wheezing but grinning through his beard. "You stood your ground, McGraw," Silas croaked. "Guess maybe the cabin finally found the man it was waiting for." Elias nodded, though his eyes were already on the chest inside. The fight had been won, but the war for the valley's soul was only beginning. The snow in the clearing bore the scars of the fight, trampled drifts, splintered wood, dark stains half buried by fresh flurries. Elias, Clara, and Silas stood silent a long while, breath steaming, listening for hoofbeats that no longer came. At last Clara lowered her pistol, her hand trembling now that the danger had passed. Elias rested his rifle against the wall, his face unreadable, though the lines around his eyes carved deeper with the weight of what lay ahead. Silas gave a gravelly laugh, shaking his head. "Never thought I'd see the day I'd put my back to a cause again. Thought I'd drowned all that in whiskey." He glanced at Elias, eyes gleaming sharp for the first time in years. "Guess you woke something in me," Elias grunted, offering the old miner a steady hand. "Sometimes a man just needs reminding what's worth standing for." The next morning Sheriff Harlow rode up, drawn by word of the gunfire. He dismounted slow, scanning the broken fence, the churned snow, the bullet holes in the cabin wall. His gaze settled on Elias, and for once there was no accusation in it, only weary understanding. "You stirred the hornet's nest, McGraw," Harlow said. "Men'll be back, and not just ranch hands this time." Talbot won't take kindly to being exposed. Elias lifted the chest from inside, setting it on the porch between them. He untied the bundle of deeds and letters, holding them out. "Then let's give him nowhere to hide. These papers show what he's done. Families bled dry, land stolen under false claims. Jedediah Coulter kept the proof. Now it's time others see it." Harlow turned the pages slowly, the fire in his eyes kindling as he read. At last he closed the bundle and looked hard at Elias. "You realize this will cut deep. Men like Talbot don't fall quiet. He'll fight with coin and guns both." Elias's reply came steady. "Then he'll find the valley ready to fight back." "I'm not the only one tired of bending." For the first time the sheriff nodded with something like respect. "Maybe so. Maybe it's time the law served the people again, not just the men who line pockets." Clara stepped forward, her voice ringing clear. "The town deserves to know. We'll bring the papers to Clearwater, spread them where everyone can read. Once the truth is out, no bribes or bullets will hide it." Silas chuckled low. "About damn time someone dragged the rot into daylight." They rode together to town 2 days later, snow crunching under hooves, the chest tied across Elias's saddle. Word spread quick, faces appeared in doorways, whispers carried down the street. When Harlow read aloud the deeds and contracts from the courthouse steps, the crowd grew restless. Farmers, trappers, and shopkeepers all leaned in, hearing in black and white what many had long suspected but feared to name. By the time Harlow finished, voices rose in anger, not at Elias but at Talbot. The rancher's name rang like a curse, men muttering of justice and debt unpaid. Clara stood near Elias, her hand brushing his arm, her eyes fierce with pride. Silas lurked at the edge, flask tucked away for once, a grin splitting his weathered face. Talbot's grip over the valley did not break in a single day, but the first crack had been struck. No longer could he move in shadows, buying silence. The people had seen the truth, and they would not forget. As the crowd dispersed, Sheriff Harlow faced Elias once more. "You've changed the shape of this place, McGraw. Whether for better or worse, time will tell. But you've earned yourself more than whispers now." Elias met his gaze, voice calm. "I didn't come here to change the valley. I came to live quiet. Seems the mountain had other plans." Clara's smile flickered soft beside him. "Or maybe it was waiting for you, Elias, just like the cabin was." Spring came late to the mountains, but when it arrived, the valley felt changed. The snow melted into rushing streams, the fields greened again, and for the first time in years, talk in Clearwater carried hope instead of fear. Talbot's name still lingered like smoke, but his grip was broken. Families began reclaiming what had been taken, small ranches planting again on soil once stolen. The fight was far from over, but the balance had shifted. Elias McGraw stood on his porch one morning, hands resting on the rail, watching the sun rise over peaks brushed with gold. The cabin behind him smelled of wood smoke and pine, its roof patched, its walls strong. He had paid $1 for it, yet the price had been measured in sleepless nights, hunger and blood spilled in snow. And still he would not trade it for anything. Clara came riding up the trail, her hair loose in the wind, her smile brighter than the morning itself. She dismounted with easy grace, carrying a basket of bread and coffee. "Thought you could use breakfast?" she said, her voice warm. Elias nodded, a rare flicker of a smile softening his features. "More than you know." They sat together on the step, sharing food in companionable silence. Clara's eyes wandered to the initials carved above the mantel inside. "Jedediah Coulter never lived to see this place at peace," she murmured. "But I think he'd be proud it still stands." Elias's gaze hardened, not with anger, but with respect. "He fought with what he had, left the rest for another to carry. Guess that fell to me." "You carried it well," Clara said. Silas Boone came later that day, sober for once, leaning on his rifle but steady in his stride. He chuckled when he saw Elias. "Never thought I'd live to see Talbot's stranglehold break." "Guess the mountain still knows how to raise men worth their salt." Elias clasped his shoulder. "Couldn't have stood without you, Silas." The old miner's eyes glistened, pride hidden beneath his gruff tone. "Don't thank me. I only followed a man who finally made the valley remember its backbone." As the weeks turned, Sheriff Harlow came to the cabin too, not with warnings this time, but with quiet acknowledgement. He looked at the cabin, at Elias, at the land stretching wide. "Strange how a place men feared for years is now the very ground that set things right," he said. Elias answered simply. The cabin wasn't cursed, it was waiting for someone to listen. When Harlow rode off, Elias sat by the fire that night with Clara and Silas, the chest of documents tucked safely away, no longer a secret, but a symbol. The cabin's silence felt different now, not heavy, not haunted, but full. It no longer pressed on him like a burden. It welcomed him, as though the voices of the past had finally found rest. As the flames crackled and shadows danced, Elias allowed himself a moment of peace. He had come searching only for quiet, for a place to lay his head. What he found was purpose, a fight not chosen but accepted, one that gave his life weight beyond solitude. He glanced at Clara, her smile soft in the firelight, then at Silas dozing with his flask untouched. The mountain had tested him, but it had also given him something more than survival. It had given him belonging. Elias leaned back, the fire warm on his face, and whispered to himself, "$1 well spent." The story of Elias McGraw and the cabin for $1 lives on as a reminder that truth, though buried, cannot be silenced, and that sometimes the harshest lands yield the strongest roots. If you've followed this journey through to the end, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. More stories of grit, survival, and forgotten secrets are waiting to be told. And before you go, click on the video suggested on your screen to ride deeper into the untold legends of the Old West.